Hi everybody, welcome to the Parallel Systems broadcast. I'm your host Mike. Thank you for tuning in to another episode. In today's show, we're going to be discussing the question, can central banks go insolvent? It's an interesting one, isn't it? What triggered this was this article, "The West's bean counters are guilty of a great white lie." And it had a subheading when it was shared on Twitter, and the subheading was, "Central banks may need a bailout." And that really interested me because I understand the system enough to know that you cannot bail out the central bank. The central bank is the top of the financial hierarchy. It doesn't go any further than them because remember, they print the currency. So at the end of the day, there's no one to print currency for them to bail them out. You can't bail out the central bank. Not entirely. Technically you can, and we're going to discuss that today. But as we get to the end of the show, I'm going to discuss why this insolvency at the central bank level is taking us very quickly to the end game scenario. And that end game scenario is going to result in a complete reset of the financial system. So let's get to it. We'll get back to that towards the end of the show. It says here, Western central banks are guilty of an enormous white lie. Well, what is it? A white lie. It says they led the public and political class to believe that quantitative easing was tantamount to printing money and that it could be reversed painlessly once the deflation threat had eased. Now, I've got to take umbrage here with the white lie statement. Can we call it a white lie? What the central bank said, can we call it a white lie when they said that quantitative easing was not going to be problematic? You see, for me, and I'm sure for you too, what a white lie means is that it has no material consequence. It's not going to lead to any real harm. Now, what the central banks have done is essentially bankrupt the entire world. It's going to push billions of people into abject poverty. It's going to destroy their wealth, potentially through hyperinflations, left, right, and center. That's what I think is going to happen. If not, just a massive deflation, probably both. And that'll lead to all kinds of problems like famine, mass deaths, hunger, starvation, war, mass migration, all kinds of issues. So I think it should not be called a white lie. I think maybe we could call it something else other than a white lie. But that to one side. It says they were throwing sand in our eyes. The process is not remotely equivalent to printing banknotes. The process is not remotely equivalent to printing banknotes. Well, let's see what Ben Bernanke has to say about that. Because as we know, Ben Bernanke is the godfather of quantitative easing. He presided over number 1, 2, Operation Twist, number 3. He was the godfather of it. So let's see what he has to say about quantitative easing.
Tax money that the Fed is spending?
It's not tax money. The banks have accounts with the Fed much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed. So it's much more akin, although not exactly the same, but it's much more akin to printing money than.
So there you go. So Ben Bernanke thinks it's akin to printing money. Maybe Mr. Ambrose Evans Pritchard, maybe he thinks it's not like printing money, but Ben Bernanke certainly does. In a rare moment of honesty from a central banker. Now, of course, it's not the same as printing money. What quantitative easing did was increase bank reserves. So what it really did was print electronic money. You know, they tapped the keyboard and all of a sudden the banks had huge reserves and that sat on the central bank's balance sheet. But that real money that we use in the economy, the paper and the coins, that didn't increase. And that's why we didn't see huge inflation in our everyday goods. Also, we had lots of cheap items from China. And of course, we had low interest rates. So this combined meant we didn't have inflation at that point. In the real economy, we did to some degree. You know, it wasn't what people often say as a no inflation environment. That's not true. The cost of living went up for lots of people. However, what we're seeing today is true rampant inflation. But that period wasn't benign because people said, oh, look, everything's fine. Nothing's changed. Everything's safe. We saved the Lehman Brothers collapsed and we saved the economy. That's not true. What happened was we created massive asset price inflation. We had huge inflation in asset prices, in housing, in stocks, in fine wine and art, classic cars, all land, everything. We had massive bubbles everywhere. And that created huge wealth inequalities. It meant the rich got richer and the people who didn't own assets got poorer, and they could no longer afford to gain assets. So it created huge wealth inequality that divided society even further, led to more internal strife and conflict, and it created the situation where we are now, where we got to this point where the central banks are now technically insolvent. Now, why are they technically insolvent? Well, because all of that paper that they hold on their balance sheets at 1%, 0.5%, all of that paper, the government bonds, because remember, that's how the government funds itself. It creates lots of pieces of paper like this, and it says, right, what we're going to put on here? Right, let's give this one 1.5% toilet paper. And then they give it to the central bank, and then the central bank goes, and it sends a load of money for that government. And that government then spends that money in the real world. And then it says, oh, I like this. I'm going to create some more. This time, let's go 0.5%. And that's how it works. That's exactly how it works. It's just a big con game. The government prints these bonds. But remember, the government has to pay back the interest. So in 10 years' time, when the bond matures, the government has to pay it back. And the central bank gets a little bit extra. In theory, that's how it works. But a lot of the pieces of paper that the governments have been creating have very short-term maturities. So it might be 3 months, it could be 6 months, it could be a year. And what we've got now is inflation. So that inflation that's coming is rendering all of those pieces of paper worthless. Now, depending on which country you're in, there's a different approach to this. But ultimately, the taxpayer is on the hook for that. The central bank mafia, they ensure that any losses go to the taxpayer. Now remember, the central banks don't really care. They don't really care about the money that they've created because it's, they've just conjured it up anyways. All they care about is continuous interest payments so they can enrich a very, very elite class of people who have control over the central banks, the shareholders, the secret shareholders nowadays. They used to be out in the open. Of course, they had to go into their little caves and scurrying underground because people started to figure out what was going on. Today, people are completely ignorant once more. Anyways, let's go back to this article because there's some other interesting parts of it that we need to talk about. And it says the consequences are catching up with the central banks because inflation is forcing them to raise interest rates at a galloping pace. They risk rendering themselves technically insolvent. Federal Reserve interest rate hikes are painful for the economy, but they are also painful for the Federal Reserve itself. It's a self-harming process. ING says the Fed has incurred a paper loss of $1 trillion, $1 trillion this year alone, on an $8.7 trillion balance sheet. Its holdings are trading at an average of 7% discount to value, and this is going to be hard to explain to Congress. So like I said, the central banks are now bankrupt officially. They're technically bankrupt now on their balance sheets, but a central bank cannot go actually bankrupt. And the reason for that is the government is the one who gets the money. The government gets the money from the central bank and uses it, but the central bank creates the money. And there's no higher authority when it comes to money than that. Besides gold, but that sits outside the system. Gold is the only true money. All of this stuff that the central bank creates is debt. It's a debt slave system. Even the governments are debt slaves unto the central bank. And the central bank itself, it can go bankrupt on its balance sheets. It can have more liabilities than it does assets. That's what's happening in central banking right now. However, it doesn't really matter because the central bank can just keep printing the money, can just create it. And it says here the Fed has also racked up an annual interest bill of $170 billion that must be paid to counterparties, either on the excess reserves of commercial banks or in its reserve repo facility. The terminology is obscure. The cost is real and will eclipse the interest income for the Fed's bond portfolio by a wide margin at US interest rates of near 5%. So there you go. So this is talking about the Federal Reserve's actual liabilities. So the reverse repo facility, and that's when the central bank actually lends money from the bank reserves and it pays an interest rate on that. So it's all looking a bit murky. It's looking a bit opaque. And we've been looking at this ourselves in recent videos. So we talked about the Swiss central bank recently, and that's mentioned here. It says the Swiss National Bank has already skidded into trouble. Over the first 9 months of this year, it lost 143 billion on its asset holdings, equal to 20% of Swiss GDP, and it has wiped out 3/4 of the Swiss National Bank's equity capital. 3/4 of its capital wiped out. And ING says that the Fed will be deep in the red next year. Ultimately, the US taxpayer will shore up the system, but the political economy implications of what has happened are not trivial. Now, you've got to remember, most of the citizens of Western nations now are tapped out. They have no extra money. They're deeply in debt themselves, and they can't go to the secret money printer themselves. So it's not like the central bank. You can't go to your closet, open it up, and find a magic ATM where you can just type in digits and it spews out the money. You don't have that. So when they come to you to pay their excesses, when they come to you to put you on the hook for their excesses, where do you get it from? Well, your standard of living has to go down, and it's continually been eroded since the 1970s. It's now collapsing through the floor, and you've got whole generations of young people who have no assets. They've got nothing. They're deeply in debt. They're living on debt. So really, we are now in this absolute debt slavery system, and people are soon going to find out that most of their assets that they do hold, the paper assets, are also really just pieces of debt too, the debt instruments. And if this system collapses because there is too much debt in the system, then all of those assets get wiped out. They get taken with it. I just wanted to show you this here. There's two. So this is the net interest costs that will account for, net interest costs will account for almost 40% of federal revenues by 2052. So what this means is that the US government is going to be paying out by 2052 almost 40% of all of its money is going to be going on interest payments. Now, of course, this system's not going to 2052. However, where we are now, it is rapidly increasing already. And we know that the US has a huge deficit. So right now in 2022, we have got a deficit in the US of 1.38 trillion. That's a huge hole in their budget. And that deficit's only going to increase because the US is essentially bankrupt already. And its spending, oh my God, its spending just goes up and up and up. And we know it's only going to go up because they just keep enacting wars, they keep enacting global crises, health scares, and I can't say it on here. You know what I'm talking about. And that's not going to end because they need that now, because this is the last ditch attempt for the US to retain its position. But that deficit spending is just going to go up. So where are they going to get the money from? Well, I'll tell you where they're going to get the money from. They're going to get it from the other side of the gun. They're going to have people staring down the barrel of an IRS agent's gun, and they're going to be shaking people out, making sure that the little guy has to pay for their excesses. That's what's going to happen. Now, one thing that's worth noting is that the central banks all have different ways of dealing with their own insolvency. So the Bank of England in the UK, that's a very special situation because the Bank of England in the UK actually has indemnity for all of its losses on the government toilet paper. Indemnity. So what that means is that every quarter, the Bank of England looks at its bond portfolio from the government and says, we've made so many billions of loss, now you've got to pay it for us. And that's what actually happens. So the Bank of England can never lose in the UK. You can, and you are, because what the government is doing is taking money from the public funds and paying the central bank, who gets to create that money out of nothing, but the government still has to pay it back. So it creates magic money out of nothing, lends it to the government, and then the government takes your taxes, it squeezes you, it ruins your standard of living to pay back for the magic money that was printed. And they have the audacity to tell you that the central bank is owned by the government. So it just really doesn't make any sense. Unless there's somebody profiting here, it doesn't make sense. And I can tell you, the central bank is profiting, but where do those profits go? You know, the central bank doesn't care about the capital repayments. What it cares about is the interest repayments. And I'll tell you why that is. Because the money that's created as capital, it gives to the government. But the interest is real money that comes back from you out of the money supply in taxes. Just think about that for a second. The money that it creates is digits that it gives to the government. But the money that comes back is actually real money from you. And that money then gets given to the shareholders of the bank. Now, you can try and figure out who the shareholders of central banks are, but they are the ones in the position of power here, and they are not going to go bankrupt. They don't care about their balance sheets being insolvent. That just gives them the excuse to take more money from you and I as taxpayers. And you can see that here because it says the Dutch central bank has written a letter to the Dutch finance minister warning that rising interest rate repayments to counterparties are eroding its equity buffers. So this is its own liabilities. And it says, for the coming years, we expect losses to be considerable, especially in 2023 and 2024, should our buffers become too depleted. Additional measures may be necessary to restore our balance sheet to solidity. Now, let's guess what those additional measures might be. It says, in an extreme case, a capital contribution from the Dutch state may be necessary. So you can see what they're doing here, the central banks. The government's bailed out the banking system. The central banks have been bailing out the governments, and now the central banks are creating full circle and saying the public must bail us out. Well, the public were bailing out at every step of the way because we was paying them money to pay the government. We was in taxation. We've been paying them all that money so that they could fund themselves, apparently, and so that they could bail out the banks. So at every point you've been squeezed dry, but now this cycle is coming into a death spiral. And of course, you're at the bottom of the food chain here. You're the one that's going to have your money taken from you. And this was the article that we spoke about recently, but it's been included in this one. The Dutch National Bank is also exploring revaluation of its large gold reserves. Now, this is a big threat. I spoke about this in my video. The reason it's a big threat is because if you look at everything that has happened throughout history from central banking, it's all about impoverishing the little guy, the taxpayer. However, since 2008, this has increased astronomically and standard of livings are falling through the floor. We've now got high inflation. And if they decide to revalue gold, you've got to think they're going to be looking to steal that from you too. If they can't steal your paper money anymore, if they can't steal your bank digits anymore, if they can't take your paper assets off you, they're going to try and take your real assets too. That's going to happen. So you got to prepare for it. It says it is likely that gold reserves will have to be mobilized in several states to boost equity capital. The barbarous relic may get its revenge on the fiat paper. Yeah, no shit. It says the Great White Lie dates back to a speech in 2002 by a young Fed governor called Ben Bernanke. Now, Nobel Prize winning Ben. The US government has a technology called a printing press, or today, its electronic equivalent that allows it to produce as many dollars as it wishes at no cost. At no cost. Well, that's not a white lie again, is it? There's been a huge cost, a massive cost to the entire globe. And really what we've been on the past few decades is a treasury bill standard, because the entire world has had to hold US treasury bills. Not for much longer. Not for much longer. Not now BRICS have got to the point where they are creating this new monetary system. Of course, it's been in design a long time, but now they're creating new ratings agencies, new investment banks. They are really creating all of the key architecture of the new monetary system to get it up and running. And unsurprisingly, we've got tons of countries now clamoring at the door to join BRICS, and some big name countries too. We're talking Saudi Arabia, who helped create the petrodollar along with the US. If you haven't seen my episode on that, you have to watch it. It'll explain it all and why it's so significant. So we've been on the treasury bill standard, and essentially what this did was it turned the entire global economy into a tributary system for the US. But that's all going to end. That's all going to end because we're coming to the end of it. There's too much debt in the system. We've got BRICS clamoring to jump out the window, get out the door, climb through the drain pipe, everything. They want to get out this system desperately, and that's happening, and that's not going to reverse at this point. The US can enact war. It's still got lots of bullets. It's still got lots of guns, but it doesn't have the dollar for much longer. And after that, all it's got is war, which is why we need a global peace movement that seeks to disarm the US. I don't mean literally, I mean metaphorically. We disarm it by saying we don't want you to enact war any longer. We don't want you to use countries of Europe to enact the war. We don't want you to ruin our energy and our economies. That's what the world needs to come together to do. Of course, the US has a tight grip on the world, so that's not going to happen. And all of the elites, they don't care about people. They don't care about war. They don't care about people dying in war. They don't care about people starving or going hungry. Or none of those things. It's only people with hearts and souls that care about those things. So don't expect that anytime soon. And it says here, the Bank for International Settlements studied the latent risk in a joint report with officials from central banks in 2018, and they concluded that a snapback in interest rates, this is following QE, was potentially dangerous. The global financial system, especially the non-bank shadow sector, had become lured into positions that it could not unwind with the flick of its fingers, and it could not withstand a rate shock. A liquidity crisis was likely. So here's something you've got to understand. You get all of these macroeconomic experts, all of the big names, you see them all online and on YouTube and on Twitter. Don't get me wrong, they're smarter than me, very smart people. However, they're not so smart, because what they often say is the Federal Reserve is behind the curve. The central banks, oh, they've just got it wrong. They just don't understand what they're doing. Oh, they've just made a mistake. And on they go, acting as though the central banks are not privy to all of the same information that they are. That the central bank doesn't have real-time data across the board. That the central bank doesn't have thousands of employees at its disposal. Some of the biggest names in finance, biggest economists, brightest sparks, brightest brains out there working for it. Of course the central bank knows what's going on, And I'm not talking about the Paul Krugmans out there. Those are the propaganda pieces for the Federal Reserve. Those are the people that spew out and reinforce the official narrative. But just like the official government narrative, they give you lies. They're lying to you, and we all know it. Why pretend that they just don't know what's going on, that they're unaware? This is silly, and it's a real naive way of looking at it. And I don't think they've got the guts to say the truth. Either that or they're naive and they just daren't admit it. But the central banks know exactly what they're doing. And like I said, the Bank of International Settlements were studying the risk of an inflation spike and also a liquidity crisis. And that's exactly where we are. It says here the report was so sensitive that they delayed publication. It was then released quietly and buried. So there you go. Does that sound like an honest central bank? One paragraph catches the eye. It warned of collateral crisis in the mark-to-market value of derivative contracts, leading to distress, fire sales. Well, that's pretty much what we saw in the LDI crisis in UK pensions. So they predicted this long time ago. Everything was predictable. When they say that QE, they just didn't realize they were just going to have to keep doing QE. That's a lie. They knew that it was QE to infinity. Everyone knew. Everyone who had any sense knew. And it says, by pushing the experiment too far and by misrepresenting the trade-off so dismissively, the central banks have tainted the whole apparatus of emergency money. The bar for a liquidity bail-in in the future is henceforth exorbitantly high, and we may well need one. So like I said, the central banks, in essence, cannot go bankrupt because they can print the money. And like I said, if you had a magic money printer yourself, you'd never go bankrupt. You could create as much debt as you want for yourself, but you couldn't go bankrupt because you could just print the money. However, one thing you've got to understand is this stuff here, these pieces of paper that we call money, it's not money, it's currency. And if you look at the central bank's balance sheet, like all balance sheets, they have assets and liabilities. And what sits on the liability side is this stuff, this paper money, currency it should be called. Actually, there is a better term for it. And what it actually is, this is a debt obligation. It's a debt obligation from the central bank to the holder. And you are the holder, I'm the holder. So we have a debt obligation. This is debt. This is paper debt with digits on it. And it's the promise to give us the value of whatever is on here. So this is just a debt token. Some call it slave tokens. That's a good way of putting it. And in much the same way, if you look at your bank account and see those digits, that is also debt. That's the bank's debt to you. So you've got two types of debt here. You've got the debt in the bank. You've got the bank owing a debt to you, which is your deposits at the bank. And then you've also got the debt with the central bank. And between the two, this one's superior, simply because if you go through Exeter's pyramid, the banking system will fail before the central banks because the central bank is at the bottom of the chain. It backstops the system. So that's why it's always better to have this cash than in the bank. They can take that money out, the electronic money, because remember, that's in the commercial banking sector. The central bank is much higher up the food chain. However, at some point, when the central bank gets to this position where it's in now, where it's got all of these assets that are now negatively yielding and they're going into what you would say is insolvency, they do have an option, and the option is simply to default on this debt. Here, they can default on this debt. They can default on any debt. But this would be the first to go, and the reason for that is because this debt obligation has no consequences. You can just print these notes and give them to you, and you can nominally default as well, because they can say, right, okay, Mr. Jones, we're going to pay you back what you're owed. So whether it's your pension or whether it's your bank deposits, and the central bank says we're going to bail out the commercial banks, they can say, right, we're going to pay you back, and then go and print out some of these pieces of paper and hand them to you. But they've defaulted because this piece of paper now is good for nothing. You can wipe your bum on it as toilet tissue, and that's about as good as it is. If you go to the shop, they'll look at it, and you'll have to, if you go to a restaurant right now in Venezuela, you've got to carry whole wheelbarrows of this. And in Argentina too. If you look at Argentina right now, they've got whole trays full of money just to pay for something that costs in America maybe $20. So they can default on this debt very easily, and that is what they're going to do. That is the next stage in this system. They have inflation back, and there is a global debt bomb. And like I said, there is 2 to 4 quadrillion in derivatives in this very opaque system. Nobody understands all of the linkages in that system. All we know is that things are starting to break, and the central banks themselves now are starting to break. As we saw with the Swiss National Bank, they had to take 20 billion from swap lines with the Federal Reserve. This was just the other week. Again, go check out that video on the Swiss Central Bank. You need to understand there's lots of moving parts here. Lots of moving parts. All of them are showing signs of distress. It looks like the system's going to fall apart any moment. You've got smoke coming out of this bit. You've got nuts and bolts going ping, ping, flying off that bit. It's a real mess out there. Pension funds raising the red flag. Bail me out, bail me out. There's so many. And then there's the German industry. German industry is now being ransacked. Deindustrialization in Germany. And so basically the system is now coming to its logical conclusion that began with the end of the Bretton Woods system. That was really the start of the end game. And then we had the dot-com bubble. Then we had the GFC. The GFC took us to a new paradigm. It took us to this treasury bill standard. We went from the gold standard in the 1920s and 30s. Then we went on to Bretton Woods, and then went on to the treasury bill standard. And now that's coming to an end, and it's been forced to come to an end even faster through BRICS. So where do we go from here? Well, it seems to me there's only one place we can go from here, and that is a collapse, a controlled demolition of the current system. It's like an old building. It's broken. It's dangerous. It's threatening to collapse itself. It's starting to sway in the wind. As you walk past it, sometimes bricks fall, dust starts to fall on your head. Everyone knows it's going to collapse. We can see the signs everywhere. So the safest thing to do right now for them, in their eyes, is to bring it down in a controlled demolition. And of course, we all know that they are experts in controlled demolitions. I'll say no more. So that's what's going to happen. Now, whilst that is going on, they have to enact constant crises. The US is enacting constant war. And one thing that I would like to discuss on this whole thing is, if you're going to bring down the system, let's imagine that that is what is happening. They're going to do a great financial reset. They're going to bring down the system. They're going to create a new one. They're going to back it with gold. There's a few things that you need to do to achieve that. First and foremost, you need to keep everyone distracted, because if they understand what's going on, they're going to trade this for real things. That's exactly what Bill Gates is doing. He's buying up all the farmland. He's like, whoa, I'm getting out of this. I know what's coming. And he does know what's coming. So he's buying up real assets. And all of the rich, wealthy elite, they're buying up real assets right now. Buying up land, buying up precious metals, buying up palaces. You name it, companies, businesses, commodities, they're buying it all. Classic cars. And to them, they don't care. They've got so much money. that it doesn't matter. When that system comes down, they've got so many assets, they've got enough assets to, and actual income producing assets where they can just restart that income in the new CBD system, farmland, whatever it is, that it doesn't matter to them. They're going to be fine. But for people like you and I'm not talking about you and I specifically, but people, the everyday Joe and Jane on the street, they've got debt obligations. They've got debt that is owed to them in the form of paper that can go to zero. The debt's been defaulted on, or like I said, they can nominally default where they just give you back a load of paper and it's worthless. Most people have debt in other areas of their life too, and all of that's going to go with the system. So if you've got a mortgage on a house, that's part of that system. When there is the great financial collapse in fact, I call it the great unraveling, because it's the unraveling of all of the lies. All of the lies will be unraveled. And if you've got a house in that system, then that's going to go down with the system, because of course, unless you can pay off the debt, you will lose it. Same if you've got credit card debt. The insolvency is essentially going to be passed to everyone. So as the central bank allows the system to come down, as they coordinate this collapse, they're going to try and keep everyone else on the boat. So it's like the Titanic. They know they're going to the iceberg and they're going to steer into it. They know it's coming and they want everyone to be on the ship. Now, of course, at the last minute, all of the chosen ones will jump in the lifeboats. You don't get to go in the lifeboat. The only way you get to go in a lifeboat is if you create your own right now. That's the only way you're getting out of this. And we talk about this on my channel. Other people talk about it too. And I talk about it a lot on my Patreon and in my new Telegram group. We're talking about how do you create that lifeboat to extricate yourself from the system as much as possible. You're not going to get out of the system entirely. But what you can do is you can prepare to become your own central bank, your own energy company, your own food company, your own water company. That's all things that I've done. And that's all things that I'm helping other people to do also. It might mean moving location. It might mean finding some new friends who actually understand what's going on too, a community. That would be useful. So these are the things that you need to start thinking of now, because this is coming. This is coming. And there's one way that you can tell it's coming, because what we're seeing right now is all of the biggest industries are getting huge payoffs. And you have to ask why that is. Big pharma, they got a big payday, huge payday. Big energy, big oil, they've got a massive payday. The military industrial complex, they've got their big payday. The three biggest industries known to man, the three most powerful lobbies known to man, they all got huge paydays. What does that tell you? What does that tell you? That some people, some very powerful and wealthy people, are now getting paid off. Once that payoff is done and they've converted their money to real hard assets, then it's game over. It's time for it all to come down. So that was today's episode. I hope you found it useful. I hope it made you just consider your own situation. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you found it useful, please share it with somebody else who you think it might help. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell for notifications. Thanks for watching, and of course, I'll see you in the next one.